A few months ago, I was browsing the internet and I saw a list of game deals. There were a lot of titles that I expected wouldn't interest me, but one piece of cover art really stood out. Little Nightmares looked like a fascinating, whimsical horror game, so I decided to download it in case it would come in useful for this class. The game is developed by Tarsier Studios, who worked on games like Little Big Planet. Although the overall tone of this game is very different from some of the others in their catalog, you can see the mechanical similarities of the action puzzle game genre. Now, after playing it through, the number one thing that made this game stick out to me was the artistry and how the players guided through the story without any dialogue in the game. From the initial reveal of each of the game's enemies, the lighting of the game hinting to the player where to go, and the environment and the character design that develop the world and its characters. Little Nightmares is a really enjoyable experience, and it's a joy to think about how things may have been designed as you're playing. There are a lot of different things you might think when you hear the word horror. But to me, the most important part of horror media is the presence of three key elements: the macabre, helplessness, and a need to survive, all of which Little Nightmares executes on. The game is beautiful in a very creepy way. The atmosphere is just unsettling, it's dimly lit, it's mysterious, things are constantly obscured by fog or darkness, and the stylization of the environments and characters only nails the point in further. Look at this guy. His skin is peeled down to block his eyes, and so he has to fumble around to find you with his unreasonably long arms, which you eventually cut off with a metal door. Look at these guys. Horrible piles of skin and fat that butcher meat and have a combination squeal/musical sting when they notice you. What about the dinner guests? Rotund eating machines that will mindlessly chase you down so they can stuff you in their stomachs, and the witch who covers her face with a mask and broke all the mirrors in her quarters to keep from seeing her own face. The macabre, overarching themes of gluttony and death are excellent in the horror genre because they're disturbing and they elicit a visceral reaction in the player. Lots of things invoke the feeling of helplessness in this game, from the contrast and the size of your character and the antagonists to the dimly lit and stylized interiors, but these are all artistic design choices. This raises the question, how does the game design create a feeling of helplessness? The key is in seriously limiting player agency. Take a second to compare Little Nightmares to games that are not in the horror genre. Sandbox games like Minecraft, multiplayer action games like Overwatch, FPS campaign games like Titanfall, all of these games are designed to make the player feel dominant. Minecraft allows you to reshape your environment, build stronger and stronger tools, and build an expansive kingdom if you so choose. Multiplayer action games like Overwatch give you superpowered abilities and weapons that you can use to dominate other players. And FPS campaign games like Titanfall put you inside a giant war robot that you use to plow your way through hordes of enemies. Now look at Little Nightmares. You can move, you can grab, and that's really about it. The player cannot kill the game's enemies. Instead, you have to sneak around them, and run away from them, and get caught by them. The game would not invoke such a visceral emotion if you could just shoot the enemies and win. The most natural aspect in human nature is an urge for survival. In just about every game you will ever play, the goal requires you to stay alive in some way. Winning a multiplayer game requires that you dispatch your opponents without being dispatched yourself, and you can't get to the end of a level if you're dead. But something very unique about the horror genre is that survival becomes the number one goal, instead of just a necessary part of some larger objective. Combined with the other points of the macabre and helplessness, survival turns into fighting for your life. Something that I find fascinating about a horror game like Little Nightmares is that the player has to be able to die. If the player could just stand still and be fine, there would be no threat. Yet the inevitable death means that you respawn or get sent back to a checkpoint, which just devalues the protagonist's life, and that reduces the threat anyways. You can't die, you just get stalled, which just leads to frustration. Some horror games get around this, but it's always at the cost of agency. These games never give the user the ability to mess it up, but the trade-off is that the disturbing themes and narrative points must carry the horror title on their own. Let's talk a little bit more about the gameplay mechanics. The player can walk, run, jump, and crouch, as well as use the grab button to pick things up, climb, swing, and throw. A lot of these mechanics are about movement, the ability to traverse the game environment. A few of them allow for certain interactivity with the environment. You can't reshape it, you can't exert your will on other beings in the game, but it's important to reiterate that the limitations and agency actually contribute to the horror experience of the game. Many pieces of the environment are designed to be interacted with as puzzle-solving mechanics. These things are not often there to allow you to explore, they're there as tools to help you survive. A lot of the game revolves around one abstract problem. I can't reach this thing, how do I get to it? The puzzle-solving core of this game can make it very engaging, but at times it can also be very frustrating. Oh, why are you stuck there, you f***ing moron? You. Even still, I find myself admiring the setup and the design of certain puzzles and game mechanics because of the ingenuity and creativity that the designers brought to the table. There were a lot of creative choices made in certain areas like the meat grinder section, the blind creature section, which then get contrasted with, near the end, the dinner guest section, where there is no way to puzzle solve your way through, you just have to make a blind dash for the end. So what is Little Nightmares about? The game is about a little girl escaping a mysterious vessel filled with grotesque characters. There's not any obvious literary theme because of the limitations of telling a story without speech. Even still, there are thematic elements, like gruesomeness, gluttony, and death, that help define the tone of the game. The visual storytelling is fantastic, and is enhanced by every set piece, many of which are riddled with hints about the lore of the world. Look at the ladies' quarters. Paintings are hung on the wall, some of which are covered. She wears a mask and she broke every mirror in her quarters so that she can't see her own face. The area is littered with mannequins in beautiful clothing to highlight both the isolation of the character and her underlying vanity and desire to be beautiful. It's incredible to think about how much story can be told without exposition, without holding the player's face up to exactly what you want them to look at. One of the biggest mistakes a lot of writers make is over-explaining something that is supposed to be scary. When you shine a bright light on something frightening, it loses its power. The ambiguity is part of the effect. If we knew the backstories of these characters, it would be less frightening, and so counterintuitively, a horror game designer has to craft a riveting story and then give the player only the pieces they need to play the game. A lot of games nowadays are focused on giving the player decisions. How many branches can we fit into the story? How many endings can we give the player? Shell describes the story machine, a type of storytelling model in games that is designed to create diversity through game mechanics rather than a curated narrative. Curiously, the more pre-scripting the designer puts into their game, like with the String of Pearls, the fewer stories their game is likely to produce. But I think too many studios are focused on this vague player metric of choice and branching stories. Studios hear players complain that they wanted more influence over the story, or that they wanted more variety in gameplay or narrative. Don't take them at their word, because what that really means is that they didn't like the story you wrote, or they didn't like the choices you gave them. The key is not to give them more options, the key is to ensure that the gameplay you provide is fun for them, and the story is good enough that they don't want to break away from it. And then the choices that you give them will be the choices that they want to make. Little Nightmares, for the most part, does a good job of this. There are no dialogue trees, there are no different endings, there's just the String of Pearls puzzle design, where you have some freedom and agency to solve the puzzles. But you have to solve the puzzles because that's the game. The player wants to solve the puzzles because they're fun, and they really don't want to be in the same room as this guy. Oh, that's not fair, that's not fair. I personally wish there was a different ending. That does not mean that I wish there were multiple endings. It means I didn't like the ending that was written. The solution is not necessarily to add in more endings, the solution would be to change the ending. And of course that solution is what would fix the game for me. My criticism is subjective. As far as player experience goes, Little Nightmares is otherworldly, atmospheric, unsettling, and at times quite frustrating. No! Why did he fall? Yeah, what the f*** is this? You do this and he falls. That's stupid. The game does a pretty good job of showing you what you're supposed to do without explicitly giving you a prompt, which takes some serious skill. Even still, there were plenty of sections I could not figure out how to solve without the internet. But in a puzzle game, the occasional difficult puzzle is to be expected. A horror game brings some interesting quirks to the idea of narrative control. You don't have to be incentivized to follow the correct path. The desire to get away from something uncomfortable or frightening is enough of a stimulus to encourage the player to follow the designed experience. There were certain parts that I did not enjoy. Above all else was the hunger mechanic, an addition that did nothing but irritate me when it came up and caused the player character to make decisions that I did not want, but had no control over. Salen and Zimmerman examine a choice in games off of 5 criteria. What happened before the player was given the choice? How is the possibility of choice conveyed to the player? How did the player make the choice? What is the result of the choice? And how is the result of the choice conveyed to the player? The decision to eat the gnome was not a decision at all. The designers had to trick you into it and gave you no alternative. Nobody would have made this decision, to the point where if it was just the gnome with no sausage, and it was implied you were supposed to eat it as it was with a rat, some players would still just refuse to do it. The problem is that the designers forced you to do something in a medium where you are supposed to be in control, which ruins the experience. But other than that, I enjoyed the game. The art design was amazing, and there was never a dull moment. There's so much information hidden around the game that develops the Maw and its gruesome characters, and I'm probably going to go back and play it through again now that I've had a chance to reflect on my experience.